Hey everyone, welcome back to Here in Apologetics. Super pumped to join us today. Today I have Dr. Clay Jones. We're going to be talking about the question of, is God immoral, and looking at the conquest of the Canaanites and seeing what's going on here, especially with related to questions with regards to ethics and God. So Dr. Jones, thank you so much for joining me. How are you today?
I'm well, and I'm glad to be with you, Zach. And I do think this is an important topic, to say the least.
Yeah, I'm super excited to talk about this because it's very important, and it's been like a series of like videos that we've been doing on our channel, looking at different views and like trying to understand everything going on here because it's very important. So before we get into like the heavy stuff today, do you want to just like introduce yourself, tell us like who you are, what you do, and what got you interested in like topics like this, Dr. Jones?
I'm a visiting scholar at Talbot School of Theology. My focus is on evil, death, and suffering, and everything and anything related to that. I have a book over here. I have a book over here entitled "Immoral: How the Fear of Death Drives Us and What We Can Do About It." So, a book on death, and then I have a book over here entitled "Why Does God Allow Evil?" And I'm writing a book on suffering. And the Canaanites. You think people may wonder how that might be related to the Canaanites, but because one of the questions you have to answer if you're going to talk about why God allows evil is, if God is good, why does it appear that he ordered so many bad things regarding the Canaanites? I also, by the way, talk about crusades, inquisitions, witch hunts, Nazi Christians, slavery, and all those things too. So I talk about anything and everything that's in any way really related to the problem of evil. And so that's what I do.
Yeah, super cool, and you got your hands in everything. So we're going to be talking about, you've written like a series of blogs on the topic, and you have a couple of like articles published with regards to this question of like the conquest of the Canaanites. So the first thing I wanted to talk about with you is like, when we're looking at the conquest of the Canaanites, one of the important things you seem to emphasize in your work is understanding, one, like the nature of our sin, and two, the nature of like the holiness of God. So as we dive into this, like how do these things play a role in looking at the conquest of the Canaanites?
Well, if you go back, and this relates to the larger problem of evil, is what's God doing in the universe? And I think what God's doing in the universe, one of the major things, one of the key things that he's doing in the universe is he's revealing to us exactly how evil creatures can be that decide to rebel against him. And the answer to that is very evil. And so when it comes to the Canaanites, the question is, so why did God order the destruction of the Canaanites? And when it comes to God's holiness, that's an abstract comment. It's not a wrong comment. I'm not saying by any way it's not wrong. I'm just saying it's abstract. Every rape, every torture, every murder, all the hideous things that people have done to one another is because they've decided to rebel against God. All of it. And so, it's like, because you can get off into this abstract sort of sense. Well, God is holy and he can't put up with sin. All of the rape and all the tortures and all the murders and all the wars and all the terrible things that have ever happened in the history of the world are one way or another resulted in creaturely rebellion against God. Now, when it comes to the Canaanites were, I have an article, and you can find this online if anybody wants to Google it, entitled "We Don't Hate Sin, So We Don't Understand What Happened to the Canaanites." That's a 9,000 word article, and it came out in a philosophy journal called Philosophia Christi. And you can get it online. Google "We Don't Hate Sin, So We Don't Understand What Happened to the Canaanites," and you'll find that article. And in it, I document the sins of the Canaanites from their own primary source documents. I think it was the 1920s. A guy was plowing a field in Palestine, and he hit this rock and he turned it over. And in it was a library of Canaanite primary source documents. And I brought those to my wife as a stack. I checked a stack out, and I brought them to my wife, and I said, "Read these." And she was excited about it, because you'd have to know my wife. She likes reading just about anything, and reading Canaanite myths was exciting. I said, and mark the places where it's really gross, so I'll put it in my article. But the reasons that God ordered the destruction of the Canaanites is actually pretty simple. You find it in Leviticus chapter 18. He lists them. It starts off with "do not commit incest," and he spends a number of verses explaining what incest is, and then he says, "don't commit adultery," and then he says, "don't a man shouldn't have sex with a man as a woman, or as he does with a woman. In other words, homosexuality. And then he goes into and mentions bestiality, and then offering your children to Molech. I missed that. That was after the heterosexual sins, which was Molech was a bull-headed god, and he had a human-like body. And in his outstretched arms, you could place a child that was burned to death, and people were offering their children to Molech. Now, here's the thing. Before that guy uncovered that rock and found all those documents, liberal Christians' comments, their reaction was, well, that wasn't really true. They really weren't that bad. But now we've got this documented. This is documented. They did all these things, and they did them a lot. And I'll just give you something that I found from W.F. Albright. It's not to him. I quote the source where you can get it from. But anyway, he mentioned, this is what first got me going on what's really going on with the Canaanites. He said, there's a Canaanite epic poem where Baal raped his sister while she was in the form of a calf 77, even 88 times. So in that Canaanite poem, we find that Baal raped his sister while she was in the form of a calf a lot. Thus the 77, even 88 times. It's just he did it a lot. So the Canaanites were able to combine rape, incest, and bestiality into the same act. And that was their god. That was their god. People tend to ape their gods. And the Canaanites aped their gods. And in my We Don't Hate Sin article, and in other articles and on my blog, I go through and document the kinds of sins that the Canaanites committed, because they committed all these sins. Incest was rampant in Canaanite culture. In fact, there's Egyptian dream books, for instance, that say, by the way, I should say about Leviticus 18, he begins it by saying, all of these sins were committed by the people of the land that I'm bringing you into. And all of these sins were committed, and then he ends by saying, these are the sins that were committed by the land I'm taking you into. And if you commit these sins, I'm going to drive you out too. So anyway, they're incredibly evil, and rape, incest, and bestiality. When it came to bestiality, having sex with animals was rampant. I mentioned this Egyptian dream book, and in this dream book, and by the way, in Leviticus 18, it says, all these sins were committed by the land I'm taking you out of, namely Egypt, and all these sins are committed by the land I'm taking you into, the land of Canaan. For instance, if a woman had a dream about having sex with a man, the dream book says that's a bad omen. That's a bad thing that she would dream about having sex with a man. But if she had a dream about having sex with a wolf or a goat or something like that, that was considered a good omen. And same with a man. It says in the dream book, it says if a man had a dream about having sex with a woman, that's a bad omen. And it goes off and lists different kinds of animals. But if he had sex with these different kinds of animals, that was a good omen. And also, if a woman had a dream about having sex with, that men and women, if they had dreams about having incestuous sex, like for instance, it said it was a good omen. For instance, it says if a man had a dream about having sex with his mother, that's a good omen. Anyway, the bottom line on this is that this was the sins of the Canaanites. And the trouble is, as you mentioned, Zach, the trouble is, in my article, I go on and point out the trouble is in our society, these things really don't offend us. Mm-hmm. And because they don't offend us, we have a tendency to go, in fact, I'm checking out this big stack of books from the Biola Library. And there was a 19-year-old, I'm going to guess she was 19-year-old blonde girl behind the counter, and a freshman or sophomore at the oldest. And I'm checking these stack of Canaanite primary source documents out. And she says, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm writing about why God ordered the destruction of the Canaanites. And she said, I've always wondered about why he did that. And I said, well, they were committing widespread rape, incest, bestiality. They were offering their children up to a bull-headed idol named Molech. And I go through and list these all out. And I'm not kidding you, but in looking at her reaction, she kind of gave me this, I don't know how else to describe it, this sort of blinking, what I would call almost Homer Simpsonian look, like Homer Simpson, kind of like she didn't get it. It was like I told her all these things they were doing, and she's like, okay, but why is the order in their destruction? And that just shows you how out of touch, frankly, that we are with how God regards, well, rape, incest, and bestiality. That these are not things to put up with at all. And so the last third of my article, I talk about how we're inoculated to it. We don't hate sin. The middle part, and by the way, this is important too. The middle part of the article is I talk about the Lord warned Israel in Leviticus 18, and he warned them in other places. If you don't drive out the Canaanites, you will commit the same sins as the Canaanites, and then I'm going to have to come and destroy you. And that's what basically the second half of the Old Testament is about, the prophets coming and saying, you're now doing the same evils that they did, and I'm coming to destroy you. And he did. And, in 722, the northern kingdoms were taken off by Assyria. Most of the overwhelming majority of people were killed. There were a few that were taken to various places in the north. And then in 586, the southern kingdom of Judah was destroyed by the Babylonians. Most of the people were killed. They were deported for 70 years. But this is important because this shows it wasn't genocide, because that's capital punishment. Because those that do such things, in God's mind, those who commit rape, incest, and bestiality deserve to die. And but we don't feel that way, of course. We're like, as long as the animal doesn't care, why should we get upset with it? So anyway, there's the overview of what was going on with all of that.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful to kind of frame the context of like understanding this, like this question of like violence in the Old Testament and like God's commands. So looking at like the Israelites then, what does God command Israel regarding the nature of sin as they're coming into the promised land from Egypt, and how's that can like impact their entry, especially with like relevance to like the conquest of like the Canaanites?
Well, it's funny. They kept the Israelites, if you read the Pentateuch, if you read, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, maybe is full of them saying, this is too hard. I didn't know it's going to be too hard. Let's go back to Egypt. In other words, they were content. The first generation was content in being in Egypt. They were like, yeah, okay, these things are going on, big deal. God basically then destroyed that generation and said, your sons and daughters, they will inherit the land. So he marched to death. For 40 years, the Lord marched to death that generation because, frankly, they were too polluted. Then the generation, their sons and daughters came on, in charge of the world, and they then took over the promised land. But so anyway, that's the gist of that.
Yeah. So one of the things it talks about, like in the biblical narrative, is this idea then about like the Israelites also needing to be like these like holy people that are like apart from sin, right? As they're entering like the promised land.
Right. Well, again, holy is a great word, and you're using it right. But the trouble is, I struggle a little bit in just talking about God's holiness. Yes, they were to be holy, but holiness means to be set apart. And in this context, what it means is don't commit incest, bestiality, homosexual acts, offer your children to Molech, which of course we suction, scrape, or scald to death here in the United States over 800,000 babies every year. We're just, like them. In fact, in a panel debate with some atheists once, Hugh Ross was on it with me. I told the atheists, I said, I think you're complaining about the Canaanites is so disingenuous because you have no trouble. I mean, they were offering their babies to a god named Molech so that their crops the famine would end. They wouldn't be destroyed by an enemy and so on. That's why they would offer their babies to Molech. You think it's okay to suction, scrape, or scald to death a baby for choice. I wanted a boy. I'm not, it's going to interrupt my career. So I think that frankly, I think atheists complaining about these things is disingenuous. It's dishonest. It's disingenuous. So anyway, that's my,
Okay.
they, by the way, they struggled with answering that because they do think it's okay to kill a baby for any reason that's 4 inches on the inside, right? 4 inches on the inside of the birth canal. If it's on the outside of the birth canal, well, that's terrible. But even though, again, Peter Singer, Princeton philosopher, ethicist, Peter Singer says he doesn't think it's a big wrong to kill an infant. And you even have bills that if the infant, as survives the abortion, it's okay to kill it once it's outside the womb. Well, and so here we are. What a mess. Here's where we are today. And this just shows you this is capital punishment that the Lord was enacting against people who were doing these things. I just refer the reader one more time. If you want to see, because my article is kind of the article of all the ones that have been written out there on what the Canaanites were doing. If you want to see what they were doing, go to We Don't Hate Sin, so we don't understand what happened to the Canaanites.
Yeah, the article is very helpful in trying to understand this, because as I was reading the article, I was like, yeah, this is pretty messed up what the Canaanites are doing, and it's yeah. So then my next question for you then, Dr. Jones, is with regards to what do the biblical texts say with regards to the invasion of the Canaanites? So what is God commanding the Israelites to do when they come into Canaan, and then what's going on here is kind of the next.
Well, he did say, and this is the hard part. He did say, I want you to go into certain towns and kill everything that breathes, including the animals. So that means, of course, that children are being killed, and animals are being killed. And so why would he do that? The point on the animals is actually very simple. You do not want animals running around that are used to having sex with children. I mean, adults. You do not want animals running around. Well, they could be having sex with children too, but you do not want animals running around that are used to having sex with adults, and human or a male or female. And I talk about that at some length. You do not want that. In fact, Hittite Law 199 says, if a man has sex with an ox, he shall die. You will kill the man for having sex with an ox. But if a man has sex with a horse, there's no penalty. What's that about? Well, oxen, of course, you use them to plow your fields and stuff, and you don't want your oxen to be trying to mount you. That's a bad thing. So you don't want animals around that are used to having sex with humans. And the real hard thing, the real issue is children. Why would God order the killing of children? Well, you had 3 choices, just 3. You could just leave them alone after you've killed their moms and dads who have been, committing all these acts. You could leave them alone to die of starvation or be eaten by animals. You could adopt them yourselves. The Israelites could adopt them, or they could take their lives quickly by the sword. The question is, why couldn't Israel adopt children? And the answer to that is because children will. I write a lot about this in my blog. I've got a blog entitled "Why Couldn't They Adopt Canaanite Children?" The trouble is they're going to bring their culture into the Canaanites, and there's just no way around that. I give a lot of examples of this, of how people are going to bring their culture. One thing that is universal, if you talk to, I've been studying this for years, and so I've been very interested when I talk to an adopted person. I'll say, I've asked them if they're very interested in their birth parents. I think I've only run into one person one time who was adopted who said, no, not really. I've never been really that interested in getting into it. Adopted children tend to be fascinated and very curious and wanting to know everything that happened with their birth parents, who they were, what they did. And so you're going to kill their parents who are guilty of these sins, and you're going to bring these children whose parents you just killed into your household. And you think these children aren't going to go, so you killed my parents, and what were they doing? how are you going to be able to, you'd have to sleep with one eye open and a sword right in your right hand, because these children, as they get older, they're going to get you. And they're going to be studying because they're going to be curious about the sins of their parents, and they're going to bring those sins into the households. And honestly, girls and boys who have been sexually molested at a young age, they're going to be seductive towards their parents and other adults that they know. And this is something, by the way, that foster parents don't like to talk about, and I won't give any examples, but foster parents have told me about their children trying to seduce them. That if the children have been sexually molested, that the children come into their households and try to do sexual things with them. You can't bring tens of thousands of children who have been sexually abused. This is a tragedy, but there's a major point here. And I'm thankful to Paul Copan, Matthew Flanagan for this, especially Paul Copan. And this is going to blow some of your viewers' minds away, but it's not always wrong to kill the innocent. And people go, what? What are you talking about? Well, let me just give you one example. Everybody watching this, anyway, we all know of 9/11, and where terrorists flew planes into the World Trade Center, into the Pentagon. They were going to fly another plane into who knows what, maybe the Capitol building, I would guess. I think the guess is the Capitol building, maybe the White House, but probably the Capitol building. What did we do in response to that? Well, we dispatched a plane, two planes. We dispatched two jets to knock Flight 93 out of the sky. Why? Because we didn't want it ramming into the U.S. Capitol or wherever their target was, but it was doubtless going to be a big target. In fact, one of the gals' last name was Penny. Our first name was Penny. I don't remember her last name offhand, but her name was. And they didn't have time to arm these jets, so they sent off a guy flying an F-16. They sent off a gal flying an F-16. He was going to hit the cockpit. She was going to hit the tail. Her hope was that just maybe when she hit the tail that she'd be able to eject and it might save her life. But before they arrived on the side, they didn't have any weapons to shoot the plane down. But anyway, but by the time they got to where Flight 93 was, it had already crashed. And by the way, her nickname then, she was nicknamed after that, Lucky Penny, because she didn't have to basically give her life for that. But my point is, if they had shot down Flight 93, I think everybody watching this would go, that was a tragedy. I think very few people would have said that was innately immoral. That killing those innocent people, because except for the three, I think there was 3 terrorists on board, except for the 3 terrorists on board, the rest of the people on Flight 93 were innocent. They weren't guilty of doing anything deserving of death. But I dare say the overwhelming majority of people viewing this, if not all of them, are going to say it would have been okay to take out Flight 93, even though we would have been killing innocent people. One last thing about children. The overwhelming majority of apologists and the overwhelming majority of Christian theologians believes that children are saved. So if children are saved, then remember it's Christianity 101. In fact, it's really dumbbell Christianity. It's Christianity 60. The end of your life here on earth is not the end of your existence. That's as basic Christianity as you're ever going to get. It's not the end of your existence, that you're going to go on into the eternal kingdom where you will face judgment. And so God is fair, and he will be fair to everybody that died, but it is not the end of your existence. It's just the end of your life here on earth. So anyway, this is a complex topic. I understand that, but I think, like I say, there's a lot of important things for us to consider. And perhaps one of the biggest is it's not always, well, the 2 biggest are, 1, it's not always wrong to kill the innocent, although it should be avoided wherever possible. And 2, this is not, dying here on earth is not the end of our existence. And I think that's a hugely important point.
Yeah, there's a lot of helpful points here. So the next question I'd love to talk about is this idea of like the text being hyperbolic, because I think a lot of people would say like when God's commanding these certain things, it's like, well, maybe it's just like referring to like maybe like military combatant or something like that. So how would you kind of wrestle with that?
A lot of people misunderstand Paul Copan's and Matthew Flanagan's argument there. And I also write about, one of my blogs is on hyperbole, and if you look in the comments, Paul Copan, who is the the originator, as far as I know, of the hyperbole argument, actually comments and says thank me for making sure that everybody understood the issues correctly, because they do not. Paul Copan and Matthew Flanagan believe that God did order the killing of children. They just think that overall there might have been some hyperbole. Once you agree that God ordered the killing of children, I'm not opposed out of hand to saying that sometimes that some of the things that were said, and they use an example like this, in a football game, we say we slaughtered the other side. Well, we don't actually mean that, they weren't actually slaughtered. We didn't cut them to pieces and hang them up as pieces of meat. So I don't get off into that very much because it's not very important. But I think a lot of people do misunderstand Matthew Flanagan and Paul Copan, because they do not believe, or they say straight out, yes, God did order the killing of children, and no, that wasn't hyperbole. So the hyperbole question doesn't really get you that far, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's really helpful. So I have one more question for you, Dr. Jones, and if there's any if there's anyone that has questions, for you to ask those. But one, probably the most dominant thing here is the question of people who may say this is a moral problem. There's this question of could a perfect God really command the killing of, say, a 3-year-old child or a baby or something like that? Because it seems a lot of people would say that there is some sort of tension here with regards to this kind of God commanding something to a child like this or something like this. So yeah.
Yeah, that's funny because it kind of misses out on the larger context of what's going on in the universe. God ordered the entire human race to die. Everybody's going to die. Everybody watching this, you're going to die. In fact, that's why I wrote a book on death, on how people deal with death. Atheists really struggle, by the way, contrary to their boasts and their bravado. And I go through how atheists are trying to deal with death. We're all going to die. And the Lord is the one who decides when we're going to die. Again, I say to that, remember, with death, and this is as basic a Christianity. It's not like I'm just pulling this out of the air. This is as basic a Christianity as you can get. Your physical death here does not end your existence. And that, I don't know how to make it any more plain than that. But yeah, sure, God has determined when everyone will die. Whether you die at 6 weeks old or 6 months old or 66 years old, God has sentenced you to death. And so what you need to do is do what it says in John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. He came to give us eternal life, but not eternal life on planet Earth. And frankly, your physical death isn't that important. Jesus said to his disciples, do not fear him who can kill the body, and after that has nothing more than he can do. He says, rather fear him who after the body is killed can cast the soul into hell. He says, yes, I tell you, fear him. And when I hear that, I go, I hear you, Jesus. You're in Jesus' considered opinion, your physical death isn't that important. Why? Because you're you're going to live forever and ever and ever, one way or another. And so anyway, just an outline of what I would say to those people.
Yeah, that's super helpful. So I appreciate that. So what we'll do now is do a little bit of Q&A. So that's at least one question. So we'll have 10 minutes or so of Q&A. But we have a question here from Jonah, which says, are the Canaanite children just recipients of capital punishment for their parents' sins? You referred to, I think this is earlier when you referred to the destruction of the Canaanites being capital punishment. So yeah, do you have any thoughts here, Dr. Jones?
I don't think that they were capitally punished, unlike their parents who were capitally punished. I think that their lives were taken simply because there was no other good choice. You either, like I say, had to adopt them, or you had to kill them, or you were going to allow them to be exposed to the elements and the animals, which would be an even worse way to die. And so, again, I would refer everybody to Flight 93. In warfare, it's not just Flight 93. In warfare, you're all, I mean, you try hard not to kill civilians. You do, but you always kill civilians. I mean, sooner or later, I mean, sometimes you just blunder like we did in Afghanistan. I mean, that was just a blunder. We only killed civilians. That was a blunder. However, in almost every war, and the war has a good purpose, often, not always, the war often has a legitimate and honest purpose. Think of Germany. But we weren't going to be able to defeat Germany, who was annihilating all the Jews, who was doing their best to destroy all the Jews. We weren't going to do it without killing some civilians. This is just the way it works. And so I think in a very real sense, then these children's deaths were just collateral damage because there was no other good way of dealing with the situation.
Okay, we have one more question from Jonah, which says, why wasn't the historicity of the Old Testament mentioned in any of the major Christian creeds? So maybe this is the question, maybe answer this and talk about like how, like the question of the historicity of the Old Testament, like understanding the importance of like getting these narratives right. Like, what are your thoughts here, Dr. Jones?
Well, not mentioned in a creed, it wouldn't have occurred to them. I mean, that would be like when it came to, the Declaration of Independence or whatever, we said, and everyone has a right to breathe. I mean, back then that wasn't something that was questioned by the people. And really, this is a 20th century thing. Not even a 19th century thing. This is a 20th century thing. We're really smart now. We know so much, and we're able to go back and go, well, this is not reliable. It just wouldn't have occurred to them any more than, Bart Ehrman complained that free will isn't taught in the Bible. And I responded to Ehrman and said, the Bible doesn't need to teach free will any more than when Joshua was commanded the men to circle Jericho, that he said to them, don't forget that walking means to put one foot in front of the other. It just simply wouldn't have occurred to them to put that in a creed because it was a given.
Okay. Well, Dr. Jones, we had a really good time here. Lots of important topics and things to think about. So do you have any kind of like last thoughts or things you get to say before we start to wrap things up here?
Yeah, I think that I encourage those who are looking at this to, one, look at your own sin and look at the sins of those around you and ask yourself, am I bothered by this? Because an awful lot of people just aren't. And that's why I go through, I mean, there's a Dr. Paul Okami who was at UCLA, and I don't remember what university he's at now, but he was at UCLA for years. And he said, it's not always wrong to have sex. That he didn't, excuse me, let me get this right. He says, I've seen that children are not always harmed by having sex with them, those that have sex with them. I mean, that we live in a society that is saying that rape and bestiality and even rape, there's a book out entitled Harmful to Minors. And the woman who wrote that book said that rape isn't, that it was considered to be acceptable in certain cultures. Well, that's what? Really? Huh? What? It's not acceptable in the U.S. culture, don't get me wrong, and it shouldn't be. But I just think that we need to come to this and realize that it's our own sin. The fact that we commit the sin, we at least, even if we're not committing the same sins of the Canaanites, we're not opposed to those who commit the sins of the Canaanites. Most relativists today will go, oh, well, yeah, they have sex with animals. I wouldn't do it. But that doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just I wouldn't do it. And so anyway, I think that I would just say, come to the scripture with humility and remember that your physical existence here is not the end of your life. You are going to live forever. And before that, you're going to be judged. And then you're going to live forever in suffering, or you're going to live ever in God's eternal kingdom where there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. But you're going to go on in one of those two areas. If that isn't true, Christianity is a false religion. But if you've already decided Christianity is a false religion, then what's the point of, why are we even talking? Because you've already assumed that it's not true anyway. But I would say, of course, that Jesus really was raised from the dead, that this really is a fact of history, and there really is a God in the universe, and he's coming back to judge the world. And so we, like I say, the children and whatever who have passed, who died, they're going to be standing before him. And I dare say, like with a majority of theologians and apologists, that children are saved.
I'm sorry that I asked for concluding remarks because we had one more question that I totally missed, Dr. Jones, but I'm sure we can fit that in right now. So Levi said, most Muslims use the genocide commanded by God in the Old Testament, or like the Conquest, as an argument to defend the violent acts committed by Muhammad to take over Mecca. So how would you respond to this, Dr. Jones?
That Islam is a false religion. And that's how I would start, as it's a false religion. Also, people have said, so if God ordered me to kill children, would I do it? No, I wouldn't. What? Why not? Because that's against everything that we know. This is not a theocracy. We don't live in a theocracy. That was a theocracy. Islam is a false religion. And the reason I say, and I'll tell you, where did they get the idea? For instance, they don't believe that Jesus died on the cross. Most atheists think that Jesus died on the cross. But Muhammad comes along, 5 centuries later and says, no, he didn't. I got a revelation. It's not true. Well, why should we believe him? Anyway, that's a false religion. But we need to understand the context of what was happening with Israel. The context is that this was a theocracy. This is something that was sui generis, means it's in a category all by itself. That God is saying, I'm going to drive these people out because of their sinfulness. And if you don't like it, well, tough taquitos, because the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords is still coming back, and you're going to be judged too.
Well, Dr. Jones, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your effort, in looking at a difficult topic like this. There's a lot to try to understand. So I do have a link down below your website with the link to your blogs on the topic, and you mentioned your article and things like that. So all kinds of resources that people can find you and things like that. So thank you so much for coming on today. It's been really a pleasure to talk with you. And yeah, I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Very good. Thank you, Zach. And I'm thankful for all the ministry that you're doing. Keep it up.
Yeah, and thank you to Levi and Jono and Jeremy and everyone else who tuned in. We wish you the best. And if you're new here, always encourage you to subscribe, leave a like, all that fun stuff. But that's it for today. We'll see you next time. So thank you, Dr. Jones, one last time, and God bless.
My pleasure. All right.